party lost in 2017, the party lost in 2019, and you're replicating to a point some of the same politics that lost in a previous organisation now within the Greens.
How is it going to win an election if it didn't work before?
It's a really good question. And the answer is that when you're a Marxist, you're not just looking at winning the next election. You're looking at building class power, right? And that is a long-term historical process. And it's not a unidirectional process. It's something that doesn't just require organising in elections and in political parties. It requires organising throughout the whole of society.
What's left? Back again in the studio. To all my leftists, I never want to see a comment ever again about how we're not left-wing enough, because you've got another Marxist with us in the chat. W's in the chat, please. Grace Blakeley.
The low A Marxist herself.
Welcome. I'm outnumbered once again. Two Marxists to one.
On the screen.
Grace, how are you? How's it all going?
I'm good, thanks. How are you guys doing?
I'm all good. A bit of a cycle, but I'm all good.
He's travelled all the way across London to the home studio. This is a new thing that we're doing now, guys. So get used to the blue walls. We are in my living room. We are taking what's left, it's
to the sitting room.
Yeah, to the sitting room. The one thing I'm worried about is when we get like really crazy right-wingers on, which is going to happen eventually, and telling them about my home address. But actually, maybe we'll record that at your yard. we'll do that in Brixton, innit? That one would be way better.
I'm glad that you've done this at this time, because I wouldn't have been able to come up to London. So yeah, this is great. I can speak to you all the way from Cornwall.
Yeah, so do you feel like, and I think this is actually kind of an interesting question, a lot of progressives right now are struggling to deal with the way the world is. Like, how do you decompress? Because you didn't always live in Newquay, right? You were in London once a time. You were a Labour member. You were IPPRing. Yeah. I've done a bit of my research. So
you read my Wikipedia page.
Come on, someone had to.
I know, right? I was in London for maybe 8 years, maybe a bit more after university, doing the whole Labour Party organising thing, also working in think tank world. Then I kind of I was saying to you guys before we started recording, I basically had a midlife crisis, and decided that I needed to do a bit of traveling. I needed to figure out what was going to happen next. This was after the kind of end of Corbynism, and then the ill-fated attempt to stop Keir Starmer from becoming leader of the Labour Party, which, by the way, I was very much a part of. I tried to stop this from happening. I tried to stop Keir Starmer from being leader, although, to be fair, our preferred candidate wasn't exactly awesome. But yeah, so after that, went away for a little bit, and then decided to move here to Cornwall, where even though the end of the world is very much as pressing as it is everywhere else, it's kind of a little bit easier to forget about it sometimes.
It sounds quite abrupt, but the kind of collapse of Corbynism, as you put it, what was so dramatic about it that you had to take a year off? What did it represent, symbolise? I don't know, mean to you?
How old are you both?
29.
No, you were at the time.
At the time, I was like a 20-something, fresh-faced Marxist.
Yeah. I was 19. 18.
Yeah. So I was just it was that election in December. It was fucking catastrophic, gut-wrenchingly awful. For those of us who were there kind of from the start, it had been a really fascinating and kind of surprising journey, because anyone who was involved with the Corbyn project from the beginning, we wanted to get Jeremy elected leader, and then really just shift the Overton window and throw out some interesting policies, see if we could build, or really just size up what the coalition for those kind of policies might look like. 2017 was a shock for all of us. The fact that Corbyn did so well, the fact that those policies proved so popular. And then over the next few years, it just became so chaotic, because, basically what happened was there was so few people within the media establishment who were willing to voice support for Corbyn or Corbyn's economic policies. And so a bunch of us who were still relatively young, fresh-faced, I think I was 23 or 24 when I started doing TV, were catapulted into all of these mainstream media shows to be right, no one's going to defend him, so that's now your job. And we spent the next few years doing that, loads of fractures ended up emerging within that coalition. We had Brexit, we had, all sorts of kind of big, complicated disagreements about various different things. And, a whole bunch of other stuff started happening. Trust broke down within the team. And it kind of became like a more and more difficult environment, particularly as it got closer to that 2019 election, and it became clear that support that we really realized was there, which was really a support for like left-wing economic transformation of the country, had been just shattered by Brexit. That cleavage had just pushed the constituency that might have gotten Corbyn elected into. And, as that became more obvious, like the infighting got worse, the trust issues got worse, the leadership became, kind of more divided and less optimistic. And so like I, for one, was like going all around the country to like loads of different constituencies, talking to people and just hearing basically like,
sounds like someone
we're
I
not
know.
voting. Yeah.
My talking
We're
tours.
like, we're not voting Labour. And that was like, it was just depressing. And then on election night, oh my God, I'll never forget it. It was so awful. Like we kind of knew that it was going to be bad, but then the results came in and it was like so bad. The top level figures on how many MPs had been elected. And I remember just being in a bunch of TV studios. For some reason, I'd agreed to go out and do all the fucking like Good Morning Britain and all that sort of stuff. And it was just a bloodbath. There's still, I think, a clip of me arguing, like full on arguing with, I think it was Jackie Smith on Good Morning Britain on like the morning after at like 6 a.m.
Policies that have been democratically developed and chosen by the Labour Party are incredibly popular.
No, they're not.
They are.
You have just gone down the biggest defeat since
nationalising the railways,
1987.
free
What part of that
broadband,
don't you understand?
70% of
What part of that don't you understand?
those policies.
At the risk of
These
winning,
people
Grace,
have
Grace,
absolutely
Grace.
no idea.
You're a
They haven't been to
robot.
Workington.
Grace.
They haven't been to
You're a robot.
Blythe.
working
They haven't been to, like, Ashfield.
I was in Workington on day. And I think after that, and just after like that loss and that sense of God, we were so close. We could have done so many good things. Jeremy then came out and said, the first thing I was going to do on day one was like end homelessness. And there's just that grief and that loss. And I think a lot of us had to go through it. And I think the people who didn't properly go through it, who like just refused to process the grief and the loss, ended up coming out much worse than those of us who were like, okay, we need to take a step back and think about what's going to happen next.
Grace, you spoke there about how Brexit was like this massive cleavage issue for the Corbyn coalition. Do you think it's still a bit of a running sore? Because look, I know you're involved with like the Green Party now, you're a supporter of Zack Polanski. I wonder whether there is a slight contradiction, or even, let's say, there's definitely at least a tension between, on the one hand, saying you want to rejoin the EU and having that as an express policy, like a cornerstone of economic policy, and also then saying that you're kind of a socialist, anti-capitalist party as well with the other hand. I mean, I'm thinking of like Bastani in my ear here, like, like the EU was a ploy,
It's
an American ploy for the upholding of the liberal market.
as the kind of Benite worldview is, it's a conspiracy of capitalism. And I think,
the EU?
The EU and the Harold Wilson, we're a people off Europe, not a people of Europe. How do you, as a democratic socialist, square that worldview?
As you guys know, I am no supporter of the European Union. I was like one of the Lexit people, although I really hate that term because it put me in a group with a bunch of like red, brown people who I just like do not have anything in common with. But yeah, I really came from the Benite view, which is primarily about democracy.
I mean, in Britain, you vote for a government and therefore the government has to listen to you. And if you don't like it, you can change it. But in Europe, all the key positions are appointed, not elected.
Yes, the European Union is a set of structures that does pretty much exist to maintain and uphold the functioning of global capitalism and European capitalism within that. But, from my understanding of like how political institutions work within a capitalist society, it's not like a simple, the EU is controlled by the elites any more than I would say like the British state is controlled by the elites. The state, from a kind of a Gramscian interpretation, from like a Palansas or whoever interpretation, we see the state as a social relation. So what happens within the state reflects the balance of power within society as a whole. Much as, people see, Marxists see capital as a social relation as well, that there's this constant pressure and tension between different class groups kind of struggling with one another. And you see that play out within state institutions. So, after the Second World War, you have strong unions and they're able to demand gains within the state. And then you get neoliberalism, the crushing of those movements, and suddenly state policy comes much more to favor capital. I think within the European Union, there's a similar sort of thing of like big structural shifts that do take place based on the balance of power within the societies that make that up, and based on a number of other different global trends. So I'm not here saying, international institutions like that could never be positive, but I do think that the EU against which we were fighting was pretty regressive, had some regressive rules that would have made it harder for a socialist government to do a lot of the things that it was doing. And then again, this Benite view, which is right, okay, how do we bring the kind of machinery of government as close to the people as possible and create just the greatest leverage for ordinary people over that machinery to kind of even out that battle that's always taking place within state institutions, within political institutions, between labor and capital. And there just weren't avenues to do that at the European level. It is so closed off from like citizen organizing, from the labor movement, from all of these different sorts of things. And yeah, for those reasons, as well as, by the way, for the reason that it was very, very obvious that making the Brexit issue the central issue of the 2019 election was going to screw over Corbyn. And, by failing to kind of make a principled case for saying, okay, well, we're going to respect the result of the referendum, but we're going to do X and Y and Z to try and minimize the economic impact, instead of just saying, like it was all a mistake, that was going to alienate people in particular constituencies where the vote was very close, and therefore result in a much bigger overall loss in terms of seats than a different position. That was also obviously very clear at the time. So yeah, I'm not like the EU as a kind of corporate like conspiracy or whatever it is that you guys said. I think, political institutions within capitalist societies, whether at the national or international level, do reflect broader social dynamics. They reflect the dynamics of class struggle nationally, internationally, and there is sometimes opportunities to shift that through struggle, but it really depends on the structure of those institutions and how democratic they are. And the EU isn't very democratic.
So are you pro Rejoin then, or are you against? I can't really tell what your position is.
I'm not pro rejoining. No. Again, and like all of these issues and questions, right? I remember talking about this a lot at the time. Like I have this intrinsic kind of resistance to the European Union along those Benite lines for all of those reasons that I've just laid out. But also, I wouldn't have been like, let's have a referendum to leave. I would never have said that. It would have been just an absurd thing to do, given all of the other things that were required before we would even have got to the point where European law and policy might have started getting in the way of the things that you would want to do as a socialist government. And it also obviously split the coalition. And this is my, main argument against rejoining. Like, why the hell would you recenter that political issue that destroyed the left over the course of however many years when you're trying to win another election? It just seems like madness. But, I also don't think that that's going to be a really significant part of the next election campaign anyway. I certainly hope it isn't, because, if reform manages to like center that divide, then that could be really good for them. But yeah, I mean, I don't agree with that. There are a few things, I don't agree with when it comes to the Green Party, just as there were a few things I didn't agree with when I was very much involved in the Labour Party. But, that's how kind of solidarity and organizing works in democratic contexts. Like if you're organizing with a bunch of people and you've made your case for X and they decide Y, you fucking get on board.
So can I just zoom out a bit, because what you brought up in terms of the state being not a neutral actor, this is quite like a central part of your critique in Vulture Capitalism, right?
Yeah.
What we've got in your analysis is not capitalism proper, in the sense of like how it's often been justified in liberalism as competition, as something where that competition generates efficiency. What you're saying is that we have loads of state intervention, and that state intervention is subsidizing capitalism, or it's centrally planning even capitalism. Can you explain a little bit more about what your general thesis is, your main critique?
Yeah, so I mean, I actually argue that the way most people, and particularly most like liberal theorists, have understood capitalism is wrong in some really important ways. And the most important way is that it rests on this separation between the political and the economic spheres. So, you know, a lot of liberal theory, from, you know, Adam Smith to Ricardo to Mill to whoever, places the economy as separate from the state, and basically says the role of good government is to figure out the best ways to kind of manage the economy, generally in line with free market principles, but, you know, there's some space on that. And when you have that kind of that view of the world, the assumption is that the state is this neutral actor, and that you as a government could kind of maneuver the levers that the state gives to you, whether that's on, you know, fiscal policy, monetary policy, changing, you know, laws and regulation, all those sorts of things, that you can just pick the state up and use those levers to shift the economy and to shift society. And the Marxist view is really a lot more complicated than that, because it really centers the fact that the economy and politics aren't separate, and that political institutions are not just captured by vested interests in like a really simple and obvious way. You know, the other kind of more extreme version would be to say like the state just exists to serve capital. And that's certainly a view that, you know, some Marxists have taken, but then it becomes harder. You can still do it, but it becomes harder to explain things like the rise of social democracy, you know, the creation of the welfare state, all that sort of stuff. Instead, I think, you know, my view is one that, as I mentioned, comes from the Gramscian tradition, which was kind of brought forward and updated in the 70s by thinkers like Nikos Palantzas. Bob Jessup is another modern commentator who writes in this tradition, which basically says the state is a social relation. Palantzas said, I mean, I don't want to get too far into this because it's kind of nerdy and it might put people off, but Palantzas
This is the right place for some of that stuff.
Don't worry, you're good.
Go straight in, dive straight in.
He said that the state was like a crystallization of a social relation, of a kind of balance of power between different classes. He also said that, you know, the working classes would always interact with that institution from a position of, from a kind of inferior position, basically not being able to exercise power in the same way within the state as capital. Because of the dynamics of capitalism. That doesn't mean that workers can't win battles within the state, but it means that those battles are won because those in charge cede some benefits as a result of this process of struggle, rather than because the workers have won it for themselves through their own institutions or through revolution or whatever. So, you know, the state is a social relation. It is characterized by constant struggle between different classes. That struggle is not equal. In a capitalist society, that struggle is fundamentally tilted in favor of capital, but that doesn't mean workers can't win certain victories within state institutions. And just to like put some meat on the bones of what this might look like, you know, in the book, I talked about the example of the Greensill scandal in the UK, when David Cameron, who was basically lobbying on behalf of this organization Greensill, which was a supply chain financing company, basically a big kind of financial institution that wasn't very well regulated, got into trouble during the pandemic. And because Cameron was a lobbyist for Greensill, he fired off a bunch of text messages to, you know, the Bank of England, to Rishi Sunak, to various different people saying, you need to give Greensill a loan. And eventually Greensill did get a loan, and it still went under and took a bunch of taxpayer money with it. Now, what this highlights is it's not just, you know, an example of malfeasance and corruption and all that sort of stuff. It really highlights the different access that different groups of people have to state institutions and how organizing within those state institutions differs between different groups. If you're David Cameron, if you're Lex Greensill, if you're a shareholder in Greensill, you have this very clear avenue through which to make your preferences known to government. If you were a nurse who lost their job during the pandemic, or someone whose business was about to close down, or who's about to lose their house, you could not message the former prime minister and say, can you ask the Bank of England to give me a loan, right? So this playing field is just like fundamentally unequal. And it means that the pressure that's exerted on those making decisions primarily comes from capital and less from Labour, especially now when the Labour movement has been defanged since the 1980s.
So a few episodes ago, we had someone called Tim Wu who came on the podcast, and he had a particular reading that was to a point similar to yours in that there are monopolies and to a point oligopolies of capitalist interests of which many democratic states are subservient to. But his solution was more towards one that was to fracture the consolidation and to establish some form of democratic capitalism. You, I guess, consider yourself a democratic socialist, where I guess he has an actualized response, which is you can break up some of those monopolies, return power to communities, and still pursue kind of private entrepreneurship. What would a socialist response be to some of the challenges that you've just raised?
Yeah, so monopoly is really important in determining how capitalism functions, particularly when you look at the global level. Monopoly capital and imperialism really go together. And some of the earliest Marxist theorists, people like Bukharin, Lenin, all saw those two things as very strongly intertwined. The idea particularly that you would get powerful monopolies that emerge in the global north and are then able to kind of enclose markets and extract profit from the global south, keeping those places in a permanent state of underdevelopment and kind of sucking super profits back into the global north. Monopolies are also important because they make it easier for capital to both win in the struggle against labor, in the class struggle against labor, and also to organize within the state. Because obviously if there's a smaller number of more powerful capitalists, you can get them all in a room together and they can figure out precisely what they need. Whereas when you have a more diffuse capitalist class, that process of kind of organizing is much more complicated. You can see this in the same way when we're talking about kind of worker organizing. When you have a more fractured and diffuse working class, it's harder to project a kind of general interest and fight for that. So monopoly is really important because it shifts the terrain of class struggle. And it shifts the terrain of struggle within the state as well in favor of capital. It's also central to the way that capitalism works. It's really impossible to imagine capitalism without monopoly, without oligopoly, without concentration. But that doesn't mean that just breaking up the monopolies is going to deal with these challenges. Monopoly power makes it easier for this power to be exerted in all these different ways, but it isn't the fundamental cause of the imbalance of power between workers and bosses. It isn't the fundamental cause of inequality. It's not the fundamental cause of crisis, although it plays a role in exacerbating those crises. The fundamental cause is, the fact of the existence of a divide between labor and capital, the fact that some people own all the stuff and make all the decisions and everyone else is forced to work for a living. Even during times when capitalism has been fairer and less monopolistic, capitalism has not been immune from crisis. It has not been completely equal. It's still had dynamics of imperialism and all of these things that we want to deal with. Not to mention, of course, now we've got the threat of climate crisis, which, yes, is exacerbated by monopoly capital, but isn't fundamentally caused by monopoly capital. So just dealing with monopolies, and this is the kind of like Elizabeth Warren view, I think, in the US, was just like in the new antitrust movement, we just need to like break up these institutions and make capitalism small again, is not going to solve those fundamental contradictions. But it could help to reduce that imbalance of power between labor and capital that makes it harder for workers to organize within companies and also to organize within the state. So there's good reason to argue for the breakup of monopolies. And yeah, I think a lot of those policy suggestions are very sensible, but that's just one step in this wider project of affecting a fundamental shift of wealth and power into the hands of working people. So my perspective in Vulture Capitalism is how do we democratize society? And that means how do we democratize wealth? So how do we really just erode this distinction between labor and capital, where one group get to own all of the most important resources that we need to produce things? And how do we also democratize governance as well? So democratize economic decision making as well as wealth, and democratize political decision making. So, creating more democratic structures within the state, and actually creating new, more democratic structures outside of the state as well. And so, yeah, like breaking up the monopolies is part of that. But relatively speaking, it's not the biggest part, I would say. There are a bunch of other things that you would want to do first, particularly things like strengthening the labor movement, decentralizing political power, that sort of stuff, that would take you further towards that vision of redistributing wealth and power.
A key critique of the kind of Keynesian worldview of full employment, or at least some of the kind of where that came out of the Beveridge report. I think is it Katatsky, who was the heterodox economist, who was talking about full employment is not the aspirations of the capitalist class. Koletsky, that's it, I can't pronounce probably. Is not the aspiration of the capitalist class. So to me, I mean, would it be fair to say that that dynamic inherently would feed its way down into smaller forms of capitalism? And so it seems as though, I mean, the whole system is rotten and we possibly have to start again.
Can you explain his view just in a bit more resolution? Or Grace, you can. This is our first ever clarification point in this chat so far. Someone's got to explain the Keynesian view a little bit more detail.
I'm trying to find it's the name of the paper. It's the full employment. There's something dynamics of full employment. The political aspects of full employment. That's the one. So Koletsky was writing it around the same time as Keynes and came up with a kind of similar way of understanding the economy in which demand was really important in influencing the ups and downs of the economic cycle. Keynes took that and said, we can really do this liberal project of using the levers of state power to create a more rational and fair type of capitalism. Basically, by understanding the dynamics of the business cycle, the state can step in at particular times. When we're going into the downswing of the business cycle, the state can step in to create jobs that will boost aggregate demand, support business investment, etc., and do the inverse at the peak of the business cycle. So that Keynesian view was very linked to that liberal tradition that I described earlier of thinking of economic and political power as separate, right? The idea that you could just take the state and then use it to do good stuff to make the economy function more effectively, which again ignores the really close links between economic and political power. Now, what Koletsky was writing about, again, much more influenced by the Marxist tradition, was to say that there are contradictions within that Keynesian approach that mean that it won't work over the long run. And one of the main contradictions that he mentioned was the fact that when you create the conditions of full employment, you get rid of or substantially reduce the whole reserve army of labor. And the reserve army of labor is really important for capital, not just because they need extra workers to be able to draw on when demand increases, but also because the threat of unemployment is a really important disciplinary device within a capitalist society. If you as a worker are not constantly worried about losing your job, you are much more likely to join a union, to demand higher wages, to just generally fight back against your boss. So the threat of unemployment is really important. And the big problem with Keynesianism was that it really reduced the fear of unemployment, both because of this state intervention to boost employment, and also because of the welfare state and the fact that, if you did lose your job, it wasn't such a significant threat to your living standards for most people. So Koletsky realized very early on, and very clear, in a very clear-eyed way, that the strength of labor would increase with the implementation of these kinds of Keynesian economic policies. And that would create contradictions and conflict within the system that would ultimately be resolved in favor of capital. And that's exactly what we saw. You know, if you look at the development of the Keynesian model after the Second World War, you saw worker power increasing really, really significantly. This reached its peak in the 1970s when we had a kind of similar situation, I guess, what we have today, big spike in oil prices, which was, bosses were attempting to pass down to workers in the form of lower real wages. And workers said, no, you're going to give us wage increases in line with inflation because that's the deal. That's the bargain upon which this entire economic structure is based, that there's going to be some bargaining over the gains from growth and that it's going to be split relatively equally. But this was a time, obviously, not just of kind of relentless expansion. It was a time of crisis for capital. And so bosses turned around and said, no, we can't do that because we need to protect our profits. And that created this head-on class conflict, which had basically been bubbling below the surface for most of the post-war period. And Kalecki predicted that and basically said, look, it's going to make workers too powerful. They're going to fight back and they're going to demand things. And neoliberalism was a response to that. It was basically a response to the fact that workers felt too confident. They weren't sufficiently scared of unemployment. And so the kind of character of the state shifted away from we're going to support full employment in order to kind of that reduce the likelihood of crisis and make capitalism fairer and make the system more stable, towards we need to make workers scared again. We need to really reassert discipline into this system. Otherwise, these people are going to continue to demand more and more and more. They're not just going to demand more of a share of the profits. They're going to start demanding a seat at the table and start wanting to make decisions about, how production is being organized. And that's not something that we can endure.
And I suppose the irony of all of that was that the buck stopped with Barbara Castle and the Labour government with In Place of Strife, where it had a load of progressive reforms and the final one was quite a punitive one to workers. So you can see how, to a point, the Labour Party in government and in opposition has served as the last bastion against, to a point, an arguable point, kind of working class militancy and advocating for their own interests.
Yeah, and also
Absolutely.
to add to that, to link to like our EU conversation, one of the big arguments against joining in the 70s, right, was that we lived in a British Keynesian tradition. We lived with stronger worker unions. We didn't want to give up. It's not the miners. It was another. Was the European coal community that our workers got paid more than comparative to the EU, and so they were worried about kind of a bottoming out of everyone kind of having to live to the same standards, essentially.
And then fast forward 30 years and our labour movement's been resolutely defeated and European unions are actually stronger. And that's why the EU suddenly looks more progressive. It's not because of the inherent progressiveness of the EU, it's because of those shifting dynamics within our societies.
Is there a case then, with that in mind, for greater protectionism, for a centre-left project in the UK to embrace a programme that centres the interests of British workers first? I mean, we're seeing the crisis ongoing in Iran, which has a global consequence and will have consequences for so many people here at home. Is there something that can be workable from a centre-left perspective that centres the economic and labour interests of British people?
This is a really important question, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, not least because a lot of the kind of challenges and contradictions that existed within the Corbyn movement hinged on this question of, I guess you could call it socialism in one country versus socialism around the world, and to what extent do we centre anti-imperialism in our politics. And this has also been something that's come back as a result of the Iran war. It's much easier now to make the argument that actually these kinds of imperial conflicts burden workers in the rich world rather than benefiting them. But we must also think back to a longer tradition which has recognized that in some ways colonialism and imperialism benefit workers in the rich world. Lenin famously wrote, when he was writing about imperialism and monopoly capitalism, that there exists a labor aristocracy in the rich world who benefits from imperialism, who benefits from the kind of, he said they were bribed through the redistribution of the super profits of empire. And if anything, that relationship is even clearer today when we think about the globalization of production and the extent to which, our lives are built on the hyper exploitation of labor in the global south. And so many of the things that we own are produced very cheaply by highly exploited workers, and that boosts our living standards. At the same time, jobs were lost in that process of outsourcing. At the same time, our societies became less equal. At the same time, we've ended up with a massive, global climate crisis. And I think this is really important because, when I think about this argument about the labor aristocracy, the idea that there's a section of the working class that benefits from imperialism, I think it's actually kind of better to say that in some ways we all benefit from imperialism, and also in some ways we all disbenefit from it. And I think this is a broader argument you could make about capitalism, right? Because if you're just purely thinking about can I access cheap goods? And, this is how a lot of people on the right will say, well, capitalism is the most amazing system in the world because it gives you so many goods, so many commodities that you can buy, things that you wouldn't even possibly been able to imagine 100 years ago, have access to them. And you can say, yeah, okay, fair enough. If that's how you conceive of what is in someone's interests, then maybe all right. But we know that actually what is in a human being's interest is much more expansive than that. We have an interest in, maintaining a livable planet. We have an interest in maintaining the social bonds that tie us together and maintaining community and having a sense of dignity, solidarity, as well as for, the vast majority of workers who still are barely earning enough to live, and those who have lost their jobs or are unable to find work. They obviously have an interest in a system that doesn't leave them destitute if they're not, in a position of having a job at that particular moment. And I think the same can be said with imperialism. If you look at it in a very narrow sense, then you might think, oh, okay, well, we just have to look after our own. We just have to look after British workers. We just have to, put up walls and prevent new people from coming in, and that will then increase the power of workers relative to capital. Or going to fight lots of imperial conflict all around the world will give us access to cheap oil and all of that sort of stuff. There's so many flaws in all of those arguments, but the big thing here is ultimately the average working class person in the rich world has more of an interest in a transformation, a total wholesale transformation of this economic system that denies them not just money, but denies them dignity, that denies them community, that denies them a livable planet, that denies them a future, than they do in extracting a little bit more from within that system. And so I think, you can see this with the arguments around the Iran war. There are some people who will be saying, could we try to justify it somehow by saying, I don't know, it's going to give us access to Iranian oil, a bit like the Venezuela thing, that's maybe going to make us better off over the long run. But it's just very obvious that firstly, it's screwing all of us over in the short run. I think in some ways the Iran war is a bit of a kind of misnomer here, because I don't actually think that it is a kind of imperial conflict in the traditional sense of something that is being waged to stabilize the capitalist world system. I actually think it was something of a mistake on Trump's part, and it's going to create more instability for global capitalism than stability. But even if we say there was there's benefit to the oil companies, they're going to access new resources and open up markets and whatever, the disbenefits that exist right now are huge. Not to mention, the very idea that makes all of these wars happen, which is we're all in this together. We all need to work towards the national interest, and that's being defined by Trump and the oil companies and the fossil fuel companies. And it just depoliticizes politics. It basically says, it's not right to argue for higher wages or government support during this time of war because, we're fighting against an evil foreign regime. So I do think there's a really strong argument to say that resisting imperialism, that basically maintaining a sense of international solidarity benefits workers everywhere. And maybe it means, support for workers' rights in China means you won't be able to access so many cheap goods. But overall, in fighting that system that is exploiting you and is exploiting the worker in China, you will be better off if you look at better off in more than just a very narrow sense.
I'm going to give away when we're recording this episode, because I don't know if you saw yesterday Trump's sit down with Sanae Takichi, the Japanese prime minister.
You know what? I haven't. I'm sorry. You've caught me off guard. Tell me.
Okay. Well, let me just tell you what. This is one of Trump's all-timers. He said he got asked, why did you not tell the Japanese or your allies about what you guys were going to do in Iran? And he said, because of the need for surprise. And he said, I don't need to tell you Japanese about surprise, because Pearl Harbor, why did you tell us about that? Which is obviously insane.
Comical.
We went in very hard, and we didn't tell anybody about it because we wanted surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay, why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay, right? You know, he's asking me. Now you believe in surprise, I think, much more so than us.
Insane. Also, I have to say, quite funny.
But he's not wrong, though.
Well, the thing is, my mate pointed this out to me, Hassan Tamluji, who we've had on the podcast before. Pearl Harbor is seen by the Japanese as their greatest ever mistake. That it was an imperialist move of destabilization, right? That it led to the end of the Japanese empire, that it's like the big disgrace in their history. So when Trump was likening it to Pearl Harbor,
you're like, you're not saying what I think you are.
Very
such a poetic metaphor
analogy about what's actually going on right now. But I think it's interesting because I've seen you say on other podcasts that you're not in favor of an idea of a socially demobile or declining working class, that if people's material conditions don't improve, if they get worse, it actually makes it harder in some ways for social organization to happen. And I guess this is why this brings it all into focus in terms of the European energy crisis that's basically about to happen, right? People's bills potentially are going to go through the roof again. And we already saw how that shock destabilized us. One of the things I'm kind of thinking about, and it is very difficult, again, for us as kind of big picture thinking lefties who are concerned, for instance, about the environment, but like the energy situation in the UK is going to come straight into focus again with our moves for decarbonisation, right? That we have the highest industrial energy costs in Europe, that we have oil that potentially in the North Sea that could be exploited, but then it would be sold on in the global market. So again, unclear whether it would bring bills down, but the idea that we're tying our hands behind our backs when it comes to exploiting diverse modes of energy could again be worse for the working classes in terms of their living standards.
And I guess that's what I mean by the protectionist program that a centre-left government could potentially enact.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing I want to say quickly, which I was just thinking about when you were talking before I get onto this energy question, is the really important distinction that we need to make between the idea of a class in itself and a class for itself. So one being just like a kind of objective constellation of people who, from the perspective of an unbiased observer, you would say they have the same class interests. And then a class for itself is not only a group that has the same class interests, it's a group that realizes that it has the same class interests and is capable of kind of organizing to fight for those interests. And I think that's really important because, again, with this imperialism question, with the energy question, you can make an argument to say there is this objective group of people that have an interest in X or Y or Z. But what's really important is how that class consciousness is formed. And that's where these arguments and these debates come into play. Because if the left does say, you have an interest in shutting us off from the rest of the world, in isolationism, in, putting up borders, in all that sort of stuff, that does in an important way play into a process of class consciousness that influences the way people understand their own class interests, basically. So, this kind of gets a little bit complicated when we're thinking about like objective material conditions and then the ideologies that surround them. But I do think it is important to say, and I think all but the most like rigid orthodox Marxists would say, that the process of kind of political discourse out of class struggle is a process that changes the way people understand their class position, changes the way people understand their interests, and puts in place certain conditions or certain constraints that make outcomes more or less likely. So if we go around saying you as the working class have an interest in, like, I don't know, let's say strong borders, right? And the process of class struggle then kind of coalesces around that argument, that shuts off some future avenues and it changes the way that people think about what it means to be a member of a particular kind of class. So again, I think it's important that we don't just talk about what is objectively in the interest of a particular group, but we also think about the arguments we're making and the kind of struggles that people are getting involved with that are gonna form how that objective set of interests develops into this idea of a class for itself, develops into a form of consciousness that allows them to fight and make demands. With the kind of energy question.
Can I just quickly come in on that point real quick,
sure.
though? Because when you boil it down to party politics, and when you kind of have to be so reductive about it as to where you choose to ally yourself politically.
Yeah.
And the party lost in 2017, the party lost in 2019, and you're replicating to a point some of the same politics that lost in a previous organisation now within the Greens. How does that correlate to anything legitimate that you can command support from voters from?
As in, like, how is it going to win an election if it didn't work before?
Yeah. It's a really good question. And the answer is that when you're a Marxist, you're not just looking at winning the next election. You're looking at building class power, right? And that is a long-term historical process. And it's not a unidirectional process. It's something that doesn't just require organising in elections and in political parties. It requires organising throughout the whole of society. And this was actually, I've said it before and I'll say it again, this was one of the weaknesses of Corbynism, which was that in a sense, it was almost kind of a top-down movement. It had a radical leadership and a radical policy agenda, but it wasn't supported by a radical and organised bloc that would have been capable of defending those policies. And what you see if you look back over the history of kind of socialist movements and socialist governments all over the world is that when you don't have that organized base that's capable of mobilizing for you, then any attempt at kind of political transformation, economic transformation ends up running up against established opposition, whether that comes in the form of the American government trying to coup you, or whether it comes in the form of your own capitalists trying to stop you from doing that. So the objective here as a Marxist is an objective of building class power, like winning the class war that is already being waged from above, rather than kind of ceding that ground and just kind of going for reformism and saying, well, what can we get within the system as a whole? And when you look at it in those terms, then the terrain that we're struggling on isn't just a terrain of winning elections. It is a terrain of organizing people within their communities to demand stuff at the local level. It's crucially a program of organizing workers within the companies that they work and also, within society as a whole to be able to make demands within economic institutions. It is a process of organizing within political parties, not just to get those political parties to win, but to change the structure of those parties. That was what Starmerism was all about. It was about preventing the Labour Party from becoming a party that was capable of really like waging class struggle on behalf of workers. And it succeeded. So that struggle has now moved somewhere else. But the struggle never really stops. It never changes. Those at the top don't stop waging class war on the rest of us. Equally, like that struggle and that resistance that comes from everywhere else doesn't stop either. It changes and it morphs from place to place and from time to time. And whether or not that translates into like viable electoral coalitions is a huge open question. I think it just so happens to be a question right now that we might be able to answer in the affirmative for the first time in a really long time. But if, the Greens don't win the next election, that doesn't mean that we're going to all turn around and be like, oh, okay, great. Well, class struggle doesn't win votes, so we're going to stop. It's not really how socialists think about the world. And that's a legitimate critique, I think, from liberals of you're too focused on these abstract ideas about shifting power. You're not focused enough on the short-term questions of winning elections. And it's a real tension that exists within any socialist movement. It was a huge tension that existed within the Corbyn movement. And it will also be a tension that comes back in the Green movement. So it's a legit question. But again, I think, as a socialist, you think about things a little bit differently.
But on your point about class in itself and class for itself, I mean, look, let's take again the EU example. It's like feels like a good one, since that's been the way the right has been effective in strategically pulling apart the left coalition. The class for itself, progressives broadly, especially those of, let's say, more of a hard left bent, they see themselves as cosmopolitan, international people. They see their struggle as crossing borders, etc., such that when you say we're going to be against perhaps protectionism of a kind, what you are kind of leaning into, I guess, is that tension of that class in itself, because we have deindustrialized, white working class people in this country who feel that they're culturally, not in tune with what the urban centers are all about and all for, versus what they feel is kind of important in terms of like their kind of cultural protection, the fact that their communities have been left behind, for instance. So how do we kind of negotiate creating a wider, I guess, strategy for more inclusive class identity? Because at the end of the day, right, that internationalism seems to be a very pertinent, natural formation for people to think of themselves as left-wing.
It's a really good point. And I think you have to start by recognizing that we don't currently have a class for itself, really, amongst the working class. There's not, I don't think, a sense of a really unified, well-organized group of people who are going out there and resisting capital in workplaces, in communities, on the streets, in politics. We are in a process of struggling to form that class identity, to make an argument that there is a group of people in society who would benefit from a fundamental transformation of our economy and of our politics in favor of working people. And that transformation would look like democratizing ownership, democratizing decision-making, all that sort of stuff. But that is not an argument that most people buy right now. Even if we think about the economic policies that are really popular, people buy them from a kind of common sense perspective, or from the perspective of, I know I'm being screwed over in some like vague way by wealthy people who are, annoying and we don't like them anyway. And I want a kind of better life, and I want to have an economy that works better in my interests rather in their interests. But there's not this sense of class solidarity of we are all a group of people who are being screwed over by the same people. Right? That isn't something that's very prevalent in our society. It's not something that's very prevalent in most advanced capitalist societies. Go back 50 years and it was. It very, very much was. I think of my communist granddad who was, left school at 14, read the Communist Manifesto, went to work in logistics, rose up ranks of the labor movement, and always maintained this solidly class-based outlook, just because that was the environment in which he grew up. That was the way you thought about things. Today, it's so different. This is the next book I'm writing is actually about this process of the rise of individualism, how we move from societies that saw ourselves in terms of these collectives that were capable of working together and fighting together for shared aims, to one in which we see ourselves, these isolated, atomized individuals. We vote in our own personal interests. We vote in our own personal, based on our own personal identities. We don't think of group identities. We don't think of ourselves as part of things. And that's, I would argue, the struggle for the left today, is how we get people to move beyond this individualism, this idea of you are on your own, you're in a market system, you have to compete to survive, you vote based on who's going to be the best for you in this particular moment in time. And instead start thinking about, right, okay, how can we move towards forming, at first, small groups of people who say, rather than just trying to get by in my own little world, I work with other people in my community to keep my local library open, to stop sewage from being spilled into my rivers, to just build something at the local level, and then go from that to how do we get workers, instead of competing against one another at the level of the firm and within these corporations, to think maybe if we worked together, we'd be able to shift this system in our favor, and then projecting that out to society as a whole. But that is a long and hard process when you're dealing with a society that's so divided, that's composed of people who are so obsessed with individualism, and where that is reinforced in every area of our culture, in everything we do on social media. Even me as a left-wing person that does Instagram, I sense that tension because I'm feeding into that and being like, you know, this is a person that you can follow who will like give you opinions that you'll like, rather than this process of what the left should be doing, which is actually like building groups and building solidarity that are capable of working together. Now, you know, I think that's a tension that we're going to have to live with for now, but that's the struggle, I would say.
Yeah, and I can see how like the Gramscian analysis is forming here, because this is all cultural, right? Like Gramsci's big thing was that politics is downstream from culture. It often feels like identity politics was, at least in its most extreme form, like a psyop to make people care only about the most atomized, individualized, lived experience parts of themselves, sometimes with very good reason, right? Because those experiences don't get centered in conversation. But if we only focus on the minutiae, we're literally blanking out the majority of people. But then again, there's that tension again, right? Because if we are living in a highly differentiated, modernized culture, which we do, where we have had, you know, the complexion of society change, you know, Jovan and I are Commonwealth babies, Commonwealth babies, you know, growing up in the UK, British as they come, English as they come in my book. But, you know, we're not seen as such by those of the hard right in this country. And so you get that level of differentiation because of immigration, because of the way in which the country has changed, which makes it very difficult to open up that conversation about we're on the same side, we're in the same struggle, because people think, well, actually, you look different to me, and actually, you have had a different cultural education, you have been raised in a different way.
And I would just quickly come in on that, and I wanted to kind of put this to you. I think amongst my left-wing friends, there's an over-dominance of culture as a kind of leading factor in all of this, which I think to a point it absolutely is determinant in some ways, but for me, I don't know, I think about like the constitution of the UK, the fact that it's unwritten, the fact that we're supposedly a sovereign people, and the fact that parliaments can, when they're ready, start to instigate cultural, political, social and economic changes. I mean, you saw that from the transition from feudalism into the early stages of capitalism. It's advanced during the Victorian period, and then how Parliament transitioned again from that period to the kind of post-war period, which then informs human interactions and a broader economic and social philosophy as to how people live their lives. Do you not think there's a case for a modern, sovereign Parliament to embrace the constitution much more effectively towards a socialist end, which can dismantle some of the institutions of individualism? And actually, we don't have to surrender everything to the state per se, but rather we can at least have confidence in our own democratic infrastructure to assert the type of society that we want. That's what, to me, justifies how I'm still in the Labour Party.
I totally get that. And I absolutely agree with you that I think we should still be struggling within the state. And there are a lot of people who say that we shouldn't bother, we should try and replace it. I do think it's more realistic, given the kind of society that we live in, to try to struggle within the institutions that we have, and shift power in that way, as well as trying to build new things where we can. But what I would say is, you know, going back to that history that you just laid out there, as a Marxist, I'm a historical materialist, right? So that means that, broadly speaking, I think those changes were driven by changes in the relations of production. So the political kind of institutions that exist, the kind of culture that we have, the kind of society that we have, shifts in those big ways due to big changes in the relations of production. Like, for example, the transition from feudalism to capitalism. That was something that begins with changing productive forces, basically, like the growth of first, you know, mining and then industrialization, which in the UK took on a very particular form of what was the aristocracy, then also in part becoming this emerging capitalist class, which was then able to organize within Parliament, within the state, to say, we want free trade, to say we want these kind of liberal political institutions that are going to support capital accumulation. And that shift was then reflected over, you know, in politics and in our culture more generally. And going back to this point about identity politics, you know, is it a psyop? I actually think it's more subtle than that, because the shift to individualism is something that is to some extent reflected by shifting relations of production. You know, the new spirit of capitalism that we get in a kind of hyper-globalized, outsourced world of large corporations, and also like increasingly precarious self-employment at the same time as that, that there is this kind of spirit of individual and personal entrepreneurship that comes as the nature of capitalism changes, and also as the rise of neoliberalism takes place as well, which is obviously accompanied by a very particular ideology, which is you're on your own, you're competing in a market system, you have to struggle against all these other people to survive and abandon those kind of collective forms of identity and solidarity in order to do that. So you can definitely tie in the rise of individualism to an objective change that happened in the economy. But what's really important about it is that it was also reinforced and re-embedded by ideology and by political changes. You know, I think about like Thatcher saying the method is economics, the object is to change the soul. That's exactly what she was talking about. She was trying to push this agenda of individualism, doing things like privatizing your pension, allowing individuals to invest in the stock market, privatizing social housing, so that then life becomes this game of building up your little stock of assets and guarding that stock of assets and competing with others around you to see who can get the biggest and the best stock of assets. That is a profoundly individualizing force that discourages you from identifying as a worker and instead encourages you to identify as a kind of mini capitalist with your little portfolio of assets. And that does push you towards seeing yourself as an isolated individual rather than as part of a collective. So I think there's like really important economic shifts that underpin all of these changes. And also, it is still possible to reflect on these changes and talk about them in such a way as to make them visible and therefore to allow us to change it. Because there isn't this like one-to-one clear and obvious relationship between base and superstructure, between what happens in the economy and how we all make sense of it. It's, as we've been discussing, it's a subject of struggle and contestation. And actually we're in a moment where we can say, yes, we do live in highly individualistic societies, and that isn't working. You know, people are fucking depressed because they feel alone. They feel like no one's got their back. Like if they fail, they'll be destitute and they're a loser because, you know, they're not fucking Andrew Tate or a crypto bro or whatever. Like that sense of isolation and precarity is driving so many people to be so unhappy. And we have a way in there of saying, right, well, it doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to be on your own. We have lived in societies that have been based on strong traditions of solidarity and collectivism and mutual support and mutual aid. And that is something that we can bring back.
I saw you put a video out about because like we're also recording this like a week after Louis Theroux's Manosphere documentary has gone, you know, has like dominated the discourse.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of work in this space over the last few years, and you know, you put a take out, which I agree with a lot of the kind of main principles, which is the Manosphere's effective recruiting tactic is essentially to acknowledge a lot of the economic disempowerment that is being felt by young people, specifically, of course, young men, and to jack up all of their kind of concerns and anxieties within that space and say, look, if you are a hyper individualized, going to go and get it just for yourself and not give a shit about the means, not give a shit about the morality of who you're fucking over to make money, then guess what? You can actually make some peace. Like you can get rich like me. But, you know, on one hand, that is true. And I definitely think that this is so much like an endpoint neoliberalism type of effect that we're seeing and experiencing. You know, look, obviously less neoliberal or less Western economies still have a problem with misogyny, of course, or traditional gender roles. We're not saying that this is unique just to our societies. But that specific idea about how the only thing that matters is making money and fuck whoever gets, you know, whoever stands in your way, being put on a pedestal and actually essentially working, right? These guys have the receipts, as they like to put it, right? They have the fast cars and they're surrounded by, you know, impressionable, often young women who care a lot about money and clout and nothing else. That this kind of reinforces itself, as you say, ideologically, because people are seeing, or these young people are seeing, oh, right, they're getting what they want and what they're talking about.
Yeah. And I think it's actually, the thing about clout is really important as well, because this whole movement, this whole culture isn't just meeting an economic need. It's also meeting a psychological need that has been undermined by neoliberalism and individualism. And it's kind of like what I was just talking about, right? It's not just that you are increasingly economically precarious and you can't afford a house and all of that sort of stuff. And that's what's driving you into the manosphere. Because there's plenty of people who are experiencing that who end up going to the left instead. It's also the fact of this market ideology that's been pushed on people, which says your value as a person is defined by the market game. You are, in some ways selling a commodity yourself in this like free market setting, and your price is reflected by, I don't know, your wage or how many likes you get on fucking dating apps or whatever. And so they've managed to really successfully link our sense of self-worth and sense of identity to a market competition in which we end up exploiting ourselves just to feel better about ourselves. And that's the real core thing about the manosphere, is that it wouldn't have just emerged in the context of economic disadvantage or like declining economic fortunes for a certain section of the population. It's particular to this age where people are encouraged to think of their whole lives as a competition to build a valuable identity that they can then sell and leverage to make more money, and that's what makes you a high value person, and it's what will get you a high value mate. And it's all that, all of these competitive forces are mediated by this kind of market game. When you think about life in those terms, like you're on your own, no one's going to have your back. If you want to prove you're worthy of love or worthy of whatever else you want, then you have to like invest in creating this identity. That is, I think it's what's led us to this point, right? Not just people wanting money, but people wanting esteem.
Are we too far gone? Because
No,
it just seems as though
gone.
that, well, I don't know, it just feels like sometimes that just characterizes, what we've just said characterizes a whole generation of people and to how they see themselves. And I just wonder, the work that we're kind of talking about is significantly bigger than an economic, cultural, social, political, constitutional, whatever kind of one. It's almost a fundamentally human question we have to re-examine ourselves with.
I want to add as well and throw this to you, because I was thinking about this as you were talking. Like, you're so right. The fact that social media has created a like quantified new form of value, which is likes, your brand, whatever, how many people are following you, all of that sort of shit, is a reflection of our broader, neoliberal market ideology. And that is what's creating more alienation, right? Because I've often thought that the reason why we as a generation are having less sex and also having less babies is, of course, a consequence of the precarious situation that many of us find ourselves in economically. But I also thought that people are having less sex because your whole life is being tracked in this kind of market way. Like everyone can follow all of your interactions in an incredibly permanent kind of way. And also, if you make any mistakes, right, there is a permanent record of that as well. So people are disincentivized from going out and taking spontaneous action in their lives. And as a result of that, we see and experience more compounding alienation. It feels like, as you're saying, is it going too far? Well, there's going to be a breakage at some point. Like we can't just like stop completely having children as a species, because that's going to fuck everything up. So as you're saying, right, like we're going to have to respond to this. And I guess the manosphere discourse at one level, probably not to like this kind of level that we're talking about, is an articulation of that, is basically saying we need to change how we're framing a lot of these issues and find a way through.
Yeah, I mean, when both of you were speaking then, actually, I was thinking, these questions around, it's not just around affecting economic change. It's about these like human questions. If we flip that Thatcher statement on its head, the method is economics, the object is to change the soul, you could equally apply that to us. Like the method is socialism, the object is to change the soul. Because we're not just talking about nationalizing the trains or taxing the rich. We're talking about creating a different subjectivity, a different way of understanding and engaging with the world. And it is not a kind of new way of understanding and engaging. In some ways it is, but it draws on something much deeper. Like if you think about what the neoliberals did really successfully, they took something that is a part of human nature, the desire to compete, to achieve status and win. And they built an entire economy around that. So that is now the fundamental value that drives our society. If we're thinking about building a socialist system, again, it isn't just about nationalizing the trains. It isn't just about taxing wealth. It is about creating a subjectivity, but it's not even about creating a subjectivity. It is about activating the fundamental human instinct to cooperation, towards care, towards solidarity, towards mutual aid, towards, creating a sense of solidarity with the environment as well and caring for the planet that we live on. It's about taking all of those natural human instincts and then building institutions that reinforce and reflect those. And that is really hard, and it has to start in our movements. And that's, I think, a really difficult thing, because too often our movements have reflected and reinforced the dynamics of individualism by creating hierarchies and, rules for how you can and cannot behave, rather than like mutually supportive spaces where we care for each other, we listen to each other, and we work things out collectively. So yeah, you're totally right to say that this is so much bigger than like an economic change. It's a social change. It's a psychological change. Actually, thinking about this, it makes me think about the work of David Graeber, who was a good friend of mine before he passed. And he, whenever anyone used to say, capitalism is just in human nature, competition is in human nature, he had the receipts to be like, no, it's not. I'm an anthropologist. I've studied cultures and societies from all over the world throughout history. We are not any more inherently competitive than we are inherently cooperative. At the end of the day, he was like, human nature is malleable. It changes, it shifts. And the way that we talk to each other, the way we relate to each other, the way we understand ourselves is so important in defining what human nature actually is.
I was going to ask you about Graeber in particular, just because I was thinking like, you're one of the kind of standout points about your Marxism and your critique is basically based in power relations and hierarchy, right? Like you are very skeptical about how those things are meted out, and you're trying to imagine a different world in which decision-making works, not just top down. And Graeber's kind of big theory, right, is that in the whole expanse of human existence, which is much bigger than maybe just the 3,500, 4,000 years of civilization or modern civilization that we've lived through, those big periods of cooperation don't leave much of a record, because there isn't a need to. If there isn't a hierarchy of like, these people are the top of the society and they need to have the special ritual rites and funerals, then we don't have any kind of record of them, anthropologically. Which is a really for me at least, it does challenge a lot of kind of like my thinking, because I'm very influenced by like John Gray as a pessimist, and what his views are of kind of the cyclical nature of humanity, and that Gray thinks of Hobbes as a liberal actually, because he's saying that otherwise we're going to be living in a state of nature, right? So I have these two tensions in my mind where I see hierarchy somewhat as necessary just for decision making to happen. It's just the way in which we're used to talk or thought and talk about these processes, but also that we don't really understand what a real kind of equal society really looks like. We don't have the record for it. Yeah,
I couldn't have summed it up better myself. That was a really excellent summary of, I think, some of the stuff that David used to talk about. Vulture Capitalism in particular was really heavily influenced by David, by two great thinkers who died actually not that long ago, who both really influenced me. One of which was Leo Panitch, whose writing on political economy has been really formative for me, and whose understanding of Marxism has been really formative for me. And the other was David, whose optimism and visceral anti-authoritarian beliefs and fascinating understanding of human nature and what it means informed my thinking about what socialism could look like or should look like. And I think there is, as you say, a lot more scope for reimagining the way that human beings can live alongside one another than you would think if you were to just take the last 2,000, 3,000 years of human history. And ultimately, like socialism, which is still at this point a very long way off. We're really talking about like, how do we build a class struggle social democracy at this point? But if we were to think of socialism as something that is achievable and is something that would end capitalism, which I still do, then it implies going through that shift again. That shift from kind of decentralized, primitive societies or whatever that were more cooperative. We then end up with several thousand years of extremely hierarchical societies. And moving towards a different kind of system would require a change once again, probably more like a synthesis. How can we combine the aspects of organization and hierarchy that have allowed us to achieve lots of stuff with also a respect for democracy and human agency?
For you, however, isn't socialism or the concept of socialism still in its infancy? Because there's no prescriptive understanding as to what socialism, or at least I think the type of socialism that you're advocating for, looks like. And it's been constantly contested throughout history. How would you draw any form of intellectual but also practical reference as to what it actually is? Because I think a lot of us can work towards this utopic society that you describe, but there hasn't really been an established history or critique of socialist ideas to where we're at the moment.
There is not a actually existing, as you say, socialist society that we can point to and say that's done. You're absolutely right. And, even Marx was talking about this, saying, I'm not going to tell you what socialism is going to look like. I don't know. It will be an entirely different kind of form that will be associated with different ways of thinking that we might even not be able to kind of come to terms with right now. But what I can say is the stuff that I'm talking about, which is really, again, as I said, class struggle, this process of class struggle, which we hope ultimately will lead to socialism, is a long and storied tradition that has included most of the world's great revolutionaries, great, left-wing thinkers, great political movements as well. If you think about the history of Marxism and of socialism, it doesn't just span the birth of social democracy in the rich world. We're talking about something that's influenced the African independence movement, that's influenced people like Thomas Sankara and Nkrumah, who write about neocolonialism and imperialism. We're talking about something that influences the Black Panther movement. We're talking about something that influences decolonial resistance movements all over the world for a really long time. And that has its roots actually in an even longer tradition of cooperativism and syndicalism that goes back, really deep into the roots of the origins of capitalism, not to mention the global labor movement on which the whole ideal of socialism is really founded. So those are the kind of, that's the tradition that I would put myself in. And again, I think it's really important that we remember to do that and to situate ourselves in historical traditions with leaders and with mentors, rather than just saying, this is my abstract understanding of the world and this is what I want to put into being. Again, because it comes back to these issues of individual versus collective. It would be very easy to be I'm picking and choosing these bits from these different political ideologies and I've come up with the most amazing view. And I actually get people emailing me all the time being hey, I've come up with a solution to all of the problems. If we just did this, then everything would be fine. And I'm okay, but where's the movement? Where's the history? Where's the tradition within which you're working to be able to say, this is something that's powerful, this is something that's historical, this is something that we can build on?
So this is what separates, I guess, myself as a Labour Party member from the Greens, is because, as you say, the whole premise of the Labour Party is founded upon a labour movement going back throughout the 19th and early 20th century. And I put it to you, and I put it to people kind of who are involved in the Greens, because I would see their historical tradition departing from elsewhere, one presupposed around the environment and ecology. And that is all perfectly right, noble and proper. But when you're looking at the circumstances of the human experience, how can, with all of that history that you've mentioned and all of that struggle, you then abandon the only political expression in the UK that has formed over 126 years in favour of something else? Because I think that is a real fundamental argument many people who have left the Labour Party have to ask themselves in the Greens. Why are they abandoning that history and tradition?
I totally understand the power of that argument. And it was something I struggled with, right, when I decided to leave the Labour Party. Leaving the Labour Party was a really hard thing for me to do, despite the fact that I was so angry about what had happened. It was ultimately when Keir Starmer said Israel has the right to cut off water and power, I was I cannot defend this. I cannot be a part of it. And it was kind of heartbreaking, because you are breaking up with this tradition that you've studied and that you've been a part of for a really, really long time. And I can completely understand why people make that argument and why people make the argument of, yes, we've got this terrible leader, we need to reclaim it. The issue is that obviously one political party doesn't own that tradition. That tradition is composed of revolutionary thinkers. It's composed even of some reformist thinkers. It's composed of labor movement activists. It's composed of politicians. It's composed of people from a number of different political parties from all over the world. And the political expression of their ideas has changed a lot over time. You know, even the Labour Party, which does have a long tradition, is still relatively recent in the history of capitalism. And there was lots of labour movement organising and socialist organising going on before then. And then the way in which that's incorporated into the Labour Party, you know, some people like Ralph Miliband, for example, argued that that laid the foundations for its ultimate kind of fall, I guess, to liberalism. The thing I realised after 2017 was that we got so close to showing that a socialist Labour Party could win elections, and in doing so could really fundamentally transform the British state. And that was something that I think most people within the Labour Party who were of the older tradition realised they could never allow to happen again. And look, like, a bunch of us fought to prevent that from happening. I supported Rebecca Long-Bailey to be leader of the Labour Party after Corbyn stepped down, basically because I realised that, like, Starmer was being used by that, like, older New Labour tradition as a way of reasserting control and discipline for the right. And that he would inevitably, after promising to continue Corbynism without Corbyn, he would inevitably shift to the right and, like, kick out the membership, remove all of the structures that we'd tried to introduce to democratize the party, to prevent this swing to the right from happening again. And that they would make sure, once that happened, that it was impossible for the left ever to take it back. And I think they've been pretty successful in doing that. Like, I don't think we'll ever see a socialist leader of the Labour Party ever again, just because of the way that they've transformed the nature of the party, the way that they've transformed the democratic structures. It's just very hard to imagine. Even the election of Jeremy Corbyn happened in large part because of an accident, which was when Ed Miliband changed the rules to allow members to sign up and vote. And that was, again, like a political accident that he didn't realize would end up having the effects that it had had. So once that happened, you know, I think all of us had a choice. I was like, okay, maybe we can try and win this back for a while. Was like trying to do some work with momentum, like trying to kind of still make this argument of stay and fight. But I think eventually it became clear, not just because of my just like visceral disgust at Starmer's stance on the war in Gaza, but also because of the way that those democratic structures were destroyed, that things weren't going to happen within the Labour Party in the way that we had perhaps once hoped that it would. After that happened, I was very open as to what would come next. I had no idea. I knew that the left would reform in some guise. I didn't know what that would look like. And then Zack Polanski told me he was running for leader of the Green Party. I've known Zack for a really long time and I think he's really great. So I was like, let's see how he goes. Let's give him a shot. Little did I know that it would end up being as successful as it has been. And I'm really pleased about that. That's not to say that there isn't a lot that's been lost in that transition, because there absolutely has. And that relationship between the party and the Labour movement in particular is something that I think is really important. And the Greens are going to have to look very carefully at in the future.
Grace, final question. What do you think the best case scenario is for the Greens at the next election? We've had Bastani on the show. He thinks there's something in the midst of 40 to 60 MPs, mainly concentrated in urban centres. Do you think that they could go beyond that?
God, I don't know. I haven't done the maths. Like, Aaron is someone who would sit down and work that out, whereas I'm more of an abstract kind of guy. But do I think... I mean, I think they could beat Labour. I think they could get a higher share of the vote than Labour. I think they could get a higher share of the vote than Reform.
That doesn't mean beat Labour in...
No.
Sorry, but that doesn't mean in...
No, it doesn't mean in terms of seats. I think they could get a higher share of the vote than both Labour and Reform. In terms of seats, I don't know. Because as you say, basically it's chaos now. We have a majoritarian electoral system which is designed for two parties, in which like upwards of 3-4 parties, sometimes more than that, are going to be competing for a single seat. So it's going to come down to like 20 votes in some constituencies. And I basically think it's a fool's game trying to predict the actual seat outcome in that context, because it's just our electoral system isn't designed for this number of parties. So it could go any way when it comes to the number of seats. Ultimately, I do think we're going to end up with something along the lines of a hung parliament. No one's going to have a clear majority. And it's going to be back to kind of pre-2017 chaos when there were loads of different political parties like fighting and swinging elections one way or another. It was only after that that really things coalesced around Labour and the Conservatives again. And that is fun because it means politics becomes much more interesting again, I would argue. Small shifts at the local level can have big implications at the national level. And that is exactly the kind of terrain that you want when you're fighting a campaign that relies on lots of members and has loads of enthusiastic people who are willing to go out and door knock for you.
Grace, thank you so much for joining us today. Loads of interesting points covered. We got deep into the theory. We spoke a little bit about the present, but there's also, I think, plenty more for us to discuss at a later date. Please 100%. Come back and join us, perhaps in person in the stew.
Next time I'm in London, I will come to your living room. That sounded like a threat, but it wasn't.
A threat or a promise? There you go. Grace, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Bye.